Hello everybody and welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here and I'm joined by Don as usual. We have a very special episode for you today. We're going to be discussing evolution and the origins of humanity and some of the issues surrounding that. So we have two guests in addition to Don and myself today. We have returning guest Mike. You also know him as Professor Pizzagate. He has some background in biological science that may be useful here. And we have a new guest, our friend Akh, and he has some background in linguistics that will be of interest when we're discussing especially the Quranic narrative around Adam. So this should be a fun one. I guess the first place to start here is to talk about what are the issues at play? What do people argue about? What's the actual debate really about? I know for myself, I am pretty disinterested in all of this. I don't really have any kind of knowledge when it comes to the science of it. So I don't have anything to really offer, contribute, or even I just barely understand the issues around that myself. And then when it comes to like the religious side of things, I just assume that whatever the truth is, it's not a real problem in terms of like my faith, that probably we just won't ever know the real answer, and that I'm just satisfied with that. But it is kind of an interesting thing how people get really up in arms about this and have really strong feelings about it. So that's something that maybe we can explore. Yeah, what do you guys think is the big hubbub around evolution?
It's interesting to see that it seems that both in the popular kind of sphere, as represented by online, Muslim Twitter or whatever you want, as well as in the scholarly domain, there's more and more discussion about the compatibility or lack thereof between Islamic theology and theories of evolution. And I'm not really sure what's driving that, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I don't know, Akh, do you have an idea about like why is this heating up, or like is it heating up?
Basically it's just that, the most pleb understanding of things is that, religion is making a certain truth claim, and quote unquote science is going against that. Religion says one thing, God created Adam, and that kind of flies in the face of the popular understanding of human origins, and people are struggling to fit that into their worldview. So,
right, yeah, I think that's basically accurate. I think it's interesting how this has appeared in the Muslim context. I don't want to keep the discussion exclusively to the Muslim context, but I guess because 3 of the 4 of us are Muslim, that's going to be kind of a major reference point for us.
Sure.
But I guess that is really the crux of the issue. It's that there is a certain understanding that we have from religion, and it's sort of held with a strong level of reverence, right? Like we kind of hold it pretty closely, this idea of Adam and Eve, and we have a particular idea around how that actually occurred. Our basis for believing in that comes from scripture and from tradition and things like that. And science has different ideas around that. Obviously, they don't use scripture for a basis of their understanding. So when they introduce certain ideas that might change that narrative a little bit, even if we can find a way to make them cohere in some sense, I think it's still people have some resistance to that and don't really want that to happen. They don't really like the idea of these non-believing scientists kind of informing their faith, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also a culture war issue in the United States with evangelical Christians and things, and that tends to then turn into a debate where it becomes a rallying point for both sides. And then when that happens, there's sort of like an overflow of that around the world and like in different sectors and stuff, as like people kind of take it on for their own purposes and stuff. So for just to, we'll just quickly for the Catholic side, I think like, I think Pope John Paul II said that evolution was more than a theory or something, which I guess not even technically true, but I mean, it's like, but yeah, I think that was the church itself, like, has kind of accepted a lot of that kind of thing. I think that as like part of it, I think is almost like as a branding kind of thing, is like saying, look at us, we're forward thinking on at least a few things. And I do think that, like, you know, in a lot of places, especially in the United States, there is that sort of crossover of people who are, you know, white Catholics, but are technically kind of somehow integrated into the evangelical sort of political subculture kind of stuff, you know? So, and I think a lot of places like across Latin America and stuff, I think there's that kind of overlap of like charismatic, you know? So it is still like, I think a widespread view amongst a lot of people that like there's some complication, at least, to the straightforward mainstream scientific story. So, yeah.
I think that context is really important, right? I mean, like the American culture war is totally projected outwards into all kinds of other societies. Then you also have, in the Muslim context, you have the colonial history of evolution being used kind of as a bludgeon in the schooling system to sort of secularize people. And then, within the kind of contemporary Muslim context, the reference that people have for kind of like, you know, other interpretations of the scientific evidence are normally like Christian intelligent design positions, or, you know, something like Alvin Plantinga's compatibilism, something like that. So yeah, the Muslim kind of scene is completely inseparable from what's going on in the US and with the Christian communities there, for sure.
Even overseas, I don't know if you've ever come across, you know, the Harun Yahya's, the sort of the things that he writes.
The Turkish guy.
Yeah, the Turkish guy. Like it's very. I think he relies a lot upon like sources that are lifted from, you know, Judeo-Christian biblical sort of narratives that aren't really central to Islam.
Yeah. So just for listeners who may not be familiar, Harun Yahya is a Turkish like preacher, I think. Like he's just sort of like he doesn't have any of. What's that?
Yeah, like God knows. I don't know. He's interesting. He's a very interesting character.
Right. Yeah. He's kind of a meme, I guess. People know him mainly from like his TV appearances, where he's like got these women that are heavily like plastic surgeryed up and stuff, like okay, real bimbofied kind of ladies.
Now I know who he is. Yeah.
Yeah. But he's most known in Turkey itself for this like this anti-evolution sort of stuff. He's published tons of books, and a lot of them are pushing that sort of idea. It's very bizarre. It's something I don't quite understand.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, just going back to the culture war issue, I think that is important to keep in mind that, yeah, like a lot of these ideas are sort of borrowed from a certain kind of political, like culture war thing that we, you know, as we call it, and that informs a lot of the affinity that you see between like when people of a certain faith go and adopt arguments from another faith, even though like you would think that they would need to kind of generate those from within their own kind of context, they just kind of like transition those over. I think it has a lot to do with that culture war thing that has definitely, like, that's been imported into the Muslim community completely. Like you have the same sort of liberal conservative arguments going on in the Muslim community that you see with Christians, and all the arguments are basically all the same. And so I imagine a lot of the concerns around evolution are the same. You know, you have the kind of liberal side that wants to promote the idea of like evolution and Islam being compatible, and it kind of comes as a package deal with all kinds of other ideas, especially the idea of like Sharia and things like that being adaptable to time and place, which is true, but like when it comes packaged under this sort of like liberal politics, it means that, you know, very specific things like women imams, no hijab, you know, even sometimes wine and pork being okay, you know, all this kind of stuff. And then on the other side, you have the conservatives who will, I mean, I don't think the idea of like evolution conflicting with religion is so much the issue, so much as they just want to oppose that other side. And so they will kind of adopt pretty hard line, like a stance that like, no, you know, our traditional understanding is this. We have no reason to believe otherwise. You know, there will be kind of arguments that come up that it's like, oh, well, it says that Adam was created by God with his own hands and stuff like this, but there's nothing like definitive you can kind of say either way that I've seen. So I feel like a lot of it is coming from like a different sort of animus. It's not necessarily just like the issue of evolution in itself. And, that's interesting in its own right, I guess.
Yeah, there's a very clear sense in which the conflict that's being construed is disconnected from either the academic evolutionary theory discourse, or kind of like even just the indigenous Muslim discourse. I mean, just to give two examples, I was just reading some scholarly treatments of how different Muslim intellectuals have dealt with evolution, and they pretty much all take as their idea of what the theory of evolution is, like a very basic, very reductionist kind of like 1950s selectionism, and they have not really caught up with any of the advances of molecular genetics. And then on the other side, you have ordinarily identified as like very, very conservative figures like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who has been in interviews kind of saying like, well, maybe evolution will prove itself out and prove to be true. And in that case, we will find a explanation that's consistent with what's in the Quran, because reality cannot contradict the Quran. And so I think, there's this disconnect, which is comes out of almost like the shifting of the discursive terrain, and people can't catch up, right? Like they don't know where they are, so they're kind of like fighting old battles and like fighting these old kind of ideological arguments that really are not where most people who are thinking about this actually are anymore.
So one of the questions I had kind of thing is that as sort of someone that doesn't know a lot about this debate is when we're talking about evolution as a controversial sort of thing, there's different components of it, right? Like, so
yeah,
are we talking about the period before, like we would say like Adam or something like that? Like, is it something like the cliche, like I didn't come from no monkey kind of thing? Like, is it the period like of sort of like the descent of man or whatever? Or are we talking about also evolution as like a process within existing society and things like that? Like in terms of, it's like the sort of the evangelical model in the United States. I think like the classic one is something like, history might only be like 6,000 years old or something, and that like creation was sort of like an instantaneous thing, that it wasn't like a sort of like, evolution over time. Yeah, like, so I was just wondering like what the components of the creationist story is. I guess there's a diverse range of them, but I guess what's the sort of standard one on that? Yeah.
I think that's part of the problem, right? Is that there are many components, and so you can get into these debates about, like, for instance, in the Muslim context, is the garden in which Adam created, is it heavenly or is it earthly? And historically, the majority of scholars held that it was heavenly, but there was a minority position that it was earthly. So you have people who are saying like, well, maybe the earthly garden could be the site at which, evolution occurred or whatever. You have people who are concerned about the parentage of Adam, like Adam can't have parents, right? Like this is a big problem for people. You have and the responses to this like really get into like kind of fine parsing, right? Like, okay, yeah, maybe the biological form of Adam preceded his ensoulment, and his like special nature is actually immaterial, right? Like it doesn't pertain to his body, so maybe there's no problem there. Like I think it's difficult for people to deal with because these issues are fairly intricate, and there are many different kinds of theological objections that you could raise to, like particularly the kind of popularly understood evolutionary narratives.
Right. So that's why I think it's useful to kind of define the kind of categories that we're going to be talking about. So Mike, do you mind sort of laying out what is the, most up-to-date biological, what does a biologist mean when he says evolution? Do you mind explaining that for us?
So I think this is part of the problem, is that it's increasingly unclear that there is a hegemony of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, which was like generally considered kind of like the orthodox interpretation of evolution, right? So this is more or less an Anglo-American kind of academic school, but it really kind of dominated, and that's the idea that evolution is driven, primarily by the action of natural selection on variation in genes. And so that's really like 1950s, 1960s population genetics stuff. Increasingly, I would say that most people are coming around to some form of mutationism, which implies that the driving force of evolution is not selection per se, but it's actually the removing of constraints by the generation of new genetic material, for instance, by genome duplication or just gene duplication or other kinds of recombination errors and stuff like that. So there's a lot more emphasis now on the processes by which genetic variability come up. There's a lot more emphasis now on different kinds of coding relations, where before we had like people thought that genes were really all that mattered, right? Like with the classical genetic tradition. So I think things have gotten very, very complicated, and it's not always clear what people mean when they're talking about evolution. And it's, I think the trouble is usually the way that it's presented, right? And it's people respond to the methodological naturalism of science, the fact that it's not making reference to any kind of supernatural entity, as implying that like no supernatural entity is required. And like that's particularly the case when people are reading about kind of older classical genetic ideas about evolution, where it's like the underlying source of variation is random mutation, right? And that kind of thing where people are saying, okay, randomness is saying there's no cause is required, therefore God's not required, he's excluded from the picture because of the use of this explanatory element. And I think it's more commonly the older stuff that trips people up, that people who are looking at maybe more recent contributions in evolution are less offended by them. Because I think there definitely was kind of an effort to attach early kind of classical genetic theories to some kind of secularization project, right? So.
Right, that was Dawkins' main stances, right? I think something about how the evolutionary process kind of proves that there can be no God. I have a very pleb understanding of it. I apologize, but
no, I think you're right. I mean, it's most clearly, those two kinds of agendas are most clearly united in a guy like Dawkins, for sure.
Yeah. So do you mind, so let's take a step back.
Sure.
And you mentioned causes. I know there's sort of the Asharis are, there's various Islamic schools that, have different ideas about, when you say, God's doing this, or God did this, or God created this.
Right.
Do you mind sort of explaining for the audience that might not be familiar with it, sort of Ashari, when an Ashari, for example, or Maturidi says, God's doing something, their sort of views on that. Do you mind explaining a little before we continue?
So I guess the very simple summary is that Asharis believe in the literal causal efficacy of God's action in every single component and moment of reality. So, they say it's an occasionalist view, but the easiest way to think of it is God is literally doing everything. God is recreating at every moment the entire universe in subtly different configurations. And there is, I think it's generally held, like Asharis are typically atomists, so they have this, conception of matter, of stuff, but they don't ascribe any causal efficacy to stuff, right? Atoms themselves on that view cannot be causing anything. The classic example that is given when explaining this is the idea that fire burns not because of the properties of fire, but because God kind of like arbitrarily decides in his wisdom to act in a habitual way such that the presence of fire is always conjoined with the presence of like combustion, right? So it's an arbitrary kind of semiotic relationship. It's a sign that doesn't in and of itself form an effective causal locus. I think maybe it might be exaggerated to the extent to which that was really like a widely held orthodoxy, but in general, like often critics of evolutionary theory, like Sheikh Noor Keller, will make reference to Ash'ari theology in order to attack kind of like causal accounts of evolution and this kind of thing. But like Ibn Taymiyyah was reacting against that conception in some of his work, and I think it's probably the case that it wasn't like really widely held necessarily among common people or whatever, that like there were no causes aside from, or no, like in some way, like nothing has effective causality except in this like really abstract sense, right? So yeah.
I mean, that gets to the point of you don't need to like argue against evolution because of this theology. I mean, if someone was claiming that any kind of scientific theory has some sort of causal sort of logic built into it generally, right? Like, we have a theory that fire burns because of combustion or whatever. Like, you're not going to argue against that. Like, well, actually it's God. Like that's not a real argument that you need to make. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and so that's why people tend to distinguish between methodological and metaphysical naturalism, right? Like, methodological naturalism just means you don't mention God, right? Like, because it makes it inaccessible to other people who are practicing in your field who may not have the same metaphysical beliefs. Like that, to me, that's a little bit suspect because, any scientific theory always implies a metaphysics, so you have to at least be conscious of it. If you have metaphysical commitments, if you're a monist, if you have a belief in God, then there are certain things that probably are incompatible with that. But from the point of view of Ash'ari theology, it is a little bit weird actually that people who take this up as a kind of traditionalist view find that it's incompatible with evolution because, like, why can't God just do evolution, right? Like, I don't know.
Right. I use this one metaphor a lot in different ways, and this is like a new way I get to apply this. But the idea is like people watching TV and talking about what's going on in the show that's on the TV, and then someone comes in and says like, "What are you talking about? There's no people there. They're not talking. It's just lights on a screen or whatever." Like, that's kind of a silly thing to say when that's not point. Like, they're not actually confused about that. It's just that they're discussing something in a different kind of framework.
Yeah, and I think we have to be maybe a little bit imaginative with this kind of stuff. I mean, we have to remember, right, that we have a metaphysics that accepts the miraculous creation of Jesus, right, of Isa in his mother without any father. So, I mean, weird stuff happens in biology all the time, by the way. I mean, there are ways to explain that in genetically if you were so inclined, but without descending into that, if it's not all that hard to imagine evolutionary theory as evolutionary processes, whatever those may be, whether you're a mutationist or something else, as providing kind of like a causal background upon which the miraculous kind of creation of Adam occurs by some mechanism that you don't need to specify in detail because it's not an article of faith. To me, it seems like maybe compatibilism should be more attractive to people than it is. And I'm not sure I understand why it's not. But I suspect the culture war part of it has something to do with it.
Yeah, you mentioned Platinga earlier. Is that how
Yeah.
you say his name?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Planting it something.
Anyway, Alvin Platinga. He's Catholic or Protestant?
He's
Right?
Protestant, I believe.
He's a Protestant. Yeah, he's pretty interesting. I'm not super familiar with his work, but I think I watched a documentary and read an article or two or something, and he seems like an intelligent, sort of reasonable person looking at this kind of stuff. And I don't remember all the arguments specifically. I don't know if you think they are worth kind of hashing out here or not.
He actually says that evolution implies that naturalism is wrong because by his view, the naturalistic evolutionary kind of process that people point to as this like undirected, like random kind of search of like biological parameter space, that process cannot produce consciousness, which I think is probably true, or at least like if it could produce a consciousness, there would be like very good reasons to doubt that consciousness is capable of like reasoning logically or anything like that. So
that's interesting.
He says that consciousness itself is like evidence that naturalism is wrong, right? The evolution of consciousness.
Yeah, I've always found it kind of interesting to think about if you adopt the really like the kind of standard, maybe reductionist, maybe like somewhat ignorant or uninformed position of like the non-believing kind of like evolution science guy sort of thing, it all sort of rests on like, oh, well, it's just random chance, but the chance of things turning out the way that they have right now, such that there is life, that there is consciousness, that things are like holding together and not like collapsing into complete like disorder all the time. That just, I don't know, it seems like it's a pretty big, I don't want to do the cliche and say it takes a leap of faith to believe that, but it seems like a lot to just say like, yeah, it just happens to, we just rolled the dice that way and that's how it played out. And then like any other thing, like we were talking about the possibility of like a miraculous birth of Jesus, that kind of thing, that seems more likely given the circumstances than the likelihood of the initial premise around evolution just being, random chance worked its way out this way, so I don't know. It's just kind of interesting to me the way that people are willing to kind of buy something if it just makes sense to them on some sort of level, and then they just go on with their lives. And I think that's kind of where a lot of the culture war sort of thing plays into it, where it gets to a point like, Mike, you've been talking pretty good detail about all this sort of stuff that is probably over many people's heads, so it's definitely over my head a little bit, and it gets to a point where it's like, this has no relevance to me.
Yeah.
It definitely has no relevance to like my afterlife or like moral judgment of my actions or anything like that. It's not to say that it's not interesting, I'm not trying to say that, but at a certain point it gets to like, well, these people are attacking my religion or they're attacking my culture or whatever, and that's what people respond to more so than like the intellectual debate.
Yeah, it's definitely not about the formal contents of evolutionary theory. It's
right.
Definitely not,
because most of the people involved in it just have like a very basic simplified understanding of the issues involved, and they're kind of just like clubbing each other back and forth with these dummy sticks.
Yeah, and the people who are advancing this kind of like, no, it's all random chance, it's all like proven by science, blah 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 blah. I mean, that case is very weak, right? Like it's not hard to find recent good scholarly work that shows that the basic underlying story that people always tell, which is like, okay, evolution is just like happens because of cosmic rays coming in and randomly making tiny changes to DNA, and that's the background process that produces the variation, and then like there are environmental changes, or like a population migrates to a new niche and then it forms a new species. I mean, it's wrong. It's like straight out wrong. The stuff that they teach kids in undergraduate evolutionary theory classes is not correct. And it's not hard to prove that, but like the people who are involved in the debates they're not actually looking at what's being published about this stuff, which is usually like pretty wild, actually. Like really encourages you to use your imagination and come up with alternative explanations more than, you know, kind of like rehashing this old, like, well, is it random or is it, you know, like, randomness doesn't mean anything. It just doesn't mean anything. For most people, it means that thing has no cause. Which, if you think about it for like more than 30 seconds, this is kind of I mean, to me, it's this is one of the telling things, right? Because like a lot of the people who are arguing about this are doctors and engineers who accept like the use of frequentist statistics, for instance, right? So they accept that there are aspects of reality that are in some way random, but, you know, they're not criticizing the methods that they use in their own professions. They're criticizing evolutionary theory, and not for, you know, necessarily the randomness aspects of it, right? Which are the really like offensive theological parts, right? Like as a Muslim, as far as I can figure, you cannot accept that there's anything like random that happens ever, right? Like that God like doesn't know, that it's like not decided in advance. Like that seems like way more anathema to me than like maybe, you know, Adam's body was created in some weird biological way. Like I don't know. I mean, to me that seems worse. But
yeah, I've always, ever since I kind of have taken this turn towards religion, that has always been the thing that has just struck me as so amazing, that people are willing to believe that like randomness means anything other than like we just aren't able to compute it. You know, like things look random until you are able to like figure out the pattern going on there, and then it's not random anymore. It just meant that it looked random to you because you weren't able to understand what was going on.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, this seems like a good time to bring in the idea that we wanted to discuss a little bit around like, so what is the actual things that we do need to believe to kind of like call ourselves Muslim or believers? And we can maybe do the same with you, Don. You can kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with this around like what the church says about this kind of stuff, but like what are like the baseline articles of belief that you need to hold, and how do they run into issues of evolution? Like, do they conflict? Are there like ways that they can conflict, but we can find ways that they can be reconciled? Like let's break that down a little bit.
Right. So there's, you know, I mean, and I apologize if I'm incorrect ahead of time. I hope, you know, Muslims don't attack me too much, but, you know, there's a couple categories of, you know, theology, that the scholars created for our benefit. And one of them is, you know, ilahiyat, study of God. You know, you have to believe God is one. He's the most merciful. You know, you have to believe in his attributes. There's nubuwat, which covers prophethood. You know, that the Prophet ﷺ had a scripture, was revealed to him, and, you know, things regarding all the prophets. But there's also a certain category that I think a lot of evolution would fall under, and it's called, you know, sam'iyat, which means just purely revealed knowledge that, you know, we just have to kind of accept because it's never been heard or seen or anything like that. So, you know, heaven would fall under that, hell, you know, that there's going to be a day of judgment, that there was a flood, and, you know, just sort of things that are just unknowable except through means of revelation.
Yeah, so there's like transmitted knowledge and revealed knowledge. Transmitted knowledge is the kind of anything that we can confirm. Transmitted knowledge is that which we know through revelation, essentially, right?
Yeah. And, you know, when it comes to the category of sam'iyat, a lot of that you have to really apply the, you know, standard of theological non-committance, meaning that, you know, personally, I can't say anything about that. It's unknowable. And if you cannot find it in scripture, you can't find it in hadith, things of that nature, you really just have to be quiet. And it's an obligation on every Muslim. So, for example, something like that would be, you know, what color are the wings of an angel? Or what's this aspect of heaven? Or, you know, things that are just really outside of the total, like the natural day-to-day of a human being that you have no way of ever seeing in your worldly life. Things in the future go under that. And also things in the past. So, like the creation of Adam. In the Quran, there's only kind of not that many ayat about it, but it says one of the ayat is inna mathal Isa inda Allah kamathal Adam khalaqahu min turabin thumma qala lahu kun fayakun, meaning that the likeness of Jesus is like that of Adam. He created him from dust, and he said be, and he was. But other than that, you really just have to say, I don't know. Like, I don't know how that creation was. And you cannot say, as an article of faith, you can't say, it was like this or it was like that. You can't say it as an article of faith, basically.
Right. But that line is interesting. I think that's often brought up, in these discussions, because I think the point that is often taken, and I think this is like the traditional understanding of that verse, is that in saying that Jesus is like Adam, the implication is that there was no like human father, right? Like Adam was created from nothing, and or not from nothing, but Adam was created by God, and Jesus likewise was kind of put on earth by God without like the normal means of reproduction. But that's not explicitly stated. It doesn't necessarily need to be interpreted that way. But I think people tend to kind of defend that traditional understanding of it because it's fairly reasonable and it fits with like a coherent narrative that's developed over centuries.
Right. I mean, and my point was only to point out that, as an article of faith, meaning that like, in order to be a Muslim, you have to believe these sort of things. Sure,
but you have to believe that it is true in some way, not in any particular way.
No. Like what I meant was like, you can't tell, like just in the category of Samiyat, for example, you can't put like a Muslim on the stand and be like, well, you have to believe all angels' wings are colored like rainbow, otherwise you're not a Muslim. Will you be like, well, I don't know?
Yeah, right. Like that's not something that can determine whether someone believes the Quran or not.
Right.
So you can't throw someone out of the religion for believing that Adam was created in like a Dragon Ball Z kind of like flash of sparks with all kinds of like swirls and a cool sound.
Right. I mean, it just wouldn't be like, it just wouldn't be a part of your faith, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's your own, like, you can have your own fan fiction, I guess, but you just need to understand that, like, that's your own take and that other people have other takes that might be backed up by a little bit more than, like, too much Saturday morning cartoons or something, and, just go from there. So let's look at, like, maybe the Christian perspective on this. Is there, like, a similar thing going on with, like, the church where they sort of have, like, a basic... like you need to believe these things and especially when it pertains to things like Adam and stuff like that. Do you know, Don?
Yeah. So I think maybe the difference here is that it sounds more like from our conversations and stuff, in Islam, there's like a set of, it's revealed truth. Like it has truth that is sort of modeling what you should be doing with your days kind of thing, like how your life should go. And, I think that the Christian narrative focuses much more on, at least from my perspective, like the whole history, every sort of like instance like of that history kind of thing. Like the creed focuses on sort of like all the interrelationships between the different people, like Jesus's place in history and like the whole arc of that kind of thing, like of him being the new Adam, and like the points in between that. I don't know, like this is just a question I have. In Islam, is Jesus like a descendant of Adam? Like that's
he
a
good question.
Like because in Christianity, Jesus is a descendant of Adam and also like of King David. Like he's like descended from the Jewish like kings kind of thing.
Yeah, through Mary. I mean, I guess the difference might be that, like, in Islam, typically, like, there's a lineage is kind of a patriarchal conception.
Not always, though.
Not always.
There's plenty of counterexamples to that don't involve, situations as, like, literally miraculous as the case with Jesus and Mary. So it might be the case that you can trace his lineage through Mary.
He is. I mean, if like Islamically, he like in the Quran, he's always called, Jesus, son of Mary. like over and over again. That's like his title.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, if
sure.
he's son of Mary, then he needs to be a descendant of Adam, like
Yeah.
logically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's,
Yeah.
We solved it, guys.
Yeah,
Well, and in the Christian story, like the symmetry between Adam and Jesus is that Adam is sort of foundational in the fall of man, and then Jesus is the sort of like restoration of the church and man through like atonement of Jesus and stuff. So like that's kind of the way that works. And then so you kind of have to anyway. So for evolution, you kind of have to there's like a specific historical like anthropology, I guess, of why these things have to exist, kind of thing, that you have to stick with. And a lot of Christians did historically believe that because of that couldn't believe in evolution, because that suggested that these sort of linkages, you know, like the creation of Adam and that and all these things, meant that the, you know, Jesus eventually historically was like descended from an ape or something, kind of thing. Like it was offensive to say, kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like I think that was sort of the thinking around that kind of thing, I think, for a lot of people. And so that's kind of the structure of the debate, I think, in some ways. But for the sort of like contemporary Catholic sort of thing, if it's much more like these things like did happen, but it's much more interested in what it says about God that those things happened, kind of thing. Like it's not, or like how it was structures like history, kind of thing, instead of like the actual biological parts of it, kind of thing. You know, like that's much more up to science, kind of thing. But the difference, I would say, is that like the minimum of what it takes to become a Christian, that also has kind of been put into jeopardy in a lot of ways, where there's so many people that probably couldn't narrate the whole basic story too, right? They wouldn't know about a lot of these components of it. But yeah, there is that sort of overarching thing of you have to believe stuff like Jesus is the Son of God and, you know, divine and all these things. But, you know, it's the same basic thing of like the dividing line thing doesn't work for where people kind of say, well, because he couldn't have been descended from something, then that's the problem. So anyways, but yeah.
That's interesting. I think you could say there's similar things going on with the Muslim situation. I mean, correct me if you think I'm wrong, guys, but I think that's fairly similar. I do think it's funny that the idea of being offended at the idea that Adam and humanity in general kind of descended from apes of some kind, when at least in the Quran it is kind of constantly telling you that, like, you know, you came from nothing, you came from dust, you know, all this kind of stuff. You came from a clot of blood, you know, you're made from clay, all this kind of stuff. Like it's not, that seems like less dignified than like a living, like somewhat intelligent animal, you know? So I don't know. That's kind of interesting to think about.
Well, just on that on that point though, is that I think that there's, you know, a lot of these things with the debate back and forth is that both sides believe that their arguments are contrived or something, right? Like they think that like the evolution kind of stuff, the traditional argument against it was more, you guys have just created this whole scientific pseudoscience around genetics and all that kind of stuff. That was kind of like the early sort of debates around this kind of thing. We're saying you guys have just made up this kind of stuff to disprove religion, and you know, that's kind of your goal. And then it's the same the other way, where people think that, like, you know, people always point this out with abortion in the United States. They always say that, like, you know, abortion as a belief, as like a subculture, political subculture, it was true that for a long time, you know, the priests and, you know, the bishops and all that were against it in the Catholic Church. Outside of that, it was like an issue kind of, but it wasn't really until, like, say, you know, the 40s, 50s, 60s that it became a political issue in the way that it became like a movement kind of thing. Like, it was almost like a strange belief that some Catholics had that was just like a traditional belief that you weren't supposed to say, go to those kind of doctors or something like that. Like, it was like a shameful thing maybe. But it didn't have the, you know, so I think that, like, the key of this kind of debate, or like especially for liberals, is that they see the other side as being invented controversy kind of thing, right? Like it's not this idea that like for thousands of years people thought that evolution was fake, and then they invented scientific ways of proving it was real, and now there's people that still don't believe it's fake. I mean, real because of ignorance or something like that kind of thing. It's more that people didn't know what was going on at all. Maybe they had some idea of descent and all that kind of stuff, whatever, back and forth. But it wasn't really a grievance or a debate or whatever until once, people basically conjured up the culture war, I think. So,
yeah.
Anyways.
I think in some ways it's almost like a battle between two like priestly castes of like scientists versus clergy, and it's more like you want your team to win kind of a thing more than it is like anything else.
Yeah,
I think in the Christian case, you kind of like by the time evolutionary theories start to come on the scene. And there were a whole bunch of them, and Darwinian evolution is only one of them, and it wasn't the orthodox one for at least a good chunk of that history. But the reason that Christianity was kind of vulnerable to these theories, like theologically, was because particular Protestant denominations had basically like really concretized particular ideas about sacred history and about, like the actual reality of heaven and hell and all of these kinds of things, right? Like it wasn't, it was because of actual kind of almost like materialist heresy in theology that it became vulnerable to materialist accounts of the origin of life or of the appearance of biological diversity or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point that I just wanted to briefly say about that. I used to get kind of a grievance about this kind of stuff about like when it came to Stalin and things like that, because in the 1920s and 30s, if you listened to, like if you were like say a general kind of left-wing person or something, and you heard on the news or whatever them talking about genetic stuff, what they were talking about a lot of the time was just like very, very simplistic racial theories and things like that. Like it was there was probably like a lot of I think Akh mentioned this earlier about like the colonialism and things like that. Like the issue around like if you just heard this kind of thing, you would think, well, that's just like bigot pseudoscience that people came up with, and compared to so I think there is sort of like a sorting process that has to go through over the decades where you can kind of then go, okay, well, maybe there's something to this in a different way or something. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, eugenics used to be part of that whole progressive package of ideas. The idea of like, we'll just breed out the bad traits, the undesirable traits, and just keep the good ones because that will be better for everyone in the future.
It's
now
very
that seems
important.
Despicable.
Yeah, it's very important to remember the origin of particular the biometricians and the early kind of selectionists were all eugenicists, and all their statistics it came right out of their programs of eugenics. So yeah, that's definitely worth mentioning as a contextual element.
And I do want to say though, I don't think that any opposition to evolution in that period was necessarily some sort of anti-eugenics. Like it wasn't like they were like the woke anti-racist, evolution disbelievers or something. But it is just interesting to see like they're it's not like it's a clean history on the other side.
Well, to be like just on one little difference is that in the Soviet Union and a lot of like socialist parties and stuff, genetics was considered fascist science a lot of the time.
Okay.
And at least okay, it's hard because I'm sure a lot of the actual scientists or like whatever had as a diversity of views within the actual sort of like ground level science kind of people, but that's where you got like people like Lysenko who really thought that like that the situation was much more complex. And we've talked about this a little bit before where he had his theories about stuff like epigenetics, like in different ways of thinking that different theories about planting and things where that people say contributed to failures of collectivization and stuff. But I always think it's funny that it is one of those things where it's you have to think about what he was seeing in the world scientific community at the same time, right? It's not like as Mike kind of said, is that like one error compounds to create another error or something, right? In some ways, where if you hear people saying, oh, you pass down genetics and that's why Aryans are the supreme race or something, it's like, okay, well, yeah, maybe there's something wrong with that and we should go our own way or something. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to go on a different thing. So we've established that, okay, it's not an article of faith for me to believe creation or animals or anything believe like they came this way or that way. Either they came down on like a strike of, Dragon Ball Z thunder, or they evolved gradually. Like as a Muslim, it's not an article of faith. And we also established that, God is doing everything, things like that. So Mike, so what exactly is, as a Muslim, like as a biologist, how would you say, what is like the standard that you'd have to say, X species is descended from another one? Like if I had a tiger today and some bones in the ground earlier, what is the standard of proof that you have to prove, like, okay, this is descended from that?
So typically what would be done is, hopefully if you can extract some DNA from your sample, you can build a phylogeny, and then you would be able to say, on the basis of probably sequence identity or some other metric, how close that sample is to other like known cat species. And that's normally how those kinds of relations are inferred. But I think it's worth mentioning probably that it's often the molecular genetic evidence that's overlooked when we're talking about evolution, because sometimes the sort of view that gets advanced as like, this should be the orthodox Muslim view, is that the species were created separately and undergo no change, right? Like that they're created separately and they're just these kinds of continuous lineages and in stasis. And that's very difficult to reconcile with the basic underlying molecular genetic observation that the genetic code is effectively conserved in all life, right? So we have a very particular relationship between genetic codons and the amino acids that they code for, that really there's very, very tiny variations in that code. But for the most part, it's conserved across all life forms, right? And it's just, this is a completely arbitrary relationship between the codons and the amino acids. And we know that because there are adapter proteins that have an arbitrary physical relationship between the coding sequences on, transfer RNAs and the amino acids. So it could be anything else. If there were independent, origins of descent for all of the different species, they could all have completely different genetic codes. They could all be using, very different developmental genetic systems or whatever, right? But that's not what we see. What we see is this fundamental consistency and homology, deep homology, even if you look at development, across orders and orders of life. To me, that's like a profound proof of the unity of God and the univocity of existence, basically. But I think it does raise that issue of like, well, are we all kind of gradually descended from some higher form, and like what is a human anyway, right? What actually distinguishes us from animals, if anything? And I think maybe that's also like a lot of what people are reacting to, right? Is these associations that we have, particularly in the Islamic tradition, right? We say that like, a human can be as good as an angel or as, like vile and low as an animal. And so we don't want to, associate ourselves with descent from creatures that, don't have any control over themselves or whatever. But, Akh, I know you're interested both in language and in primatology. So I want to get your take on this. There's the theory that humans are differentiated from their, presumed kind of like ape ancestor by like fetalization and, neoteny, right? So we have this period outside of the womb that's, unlike most other mammals where we're still basically like a fetus. And some people say that, this is what actually gives rise to language, is that we have this external fetal development where we're exposed to language and people talking to us all the time. And this is kind of the unique feature of humans as opposed to their ancestors. And I thought that was kind of interesting because we talk in Islam all the time in the Islamic tradition about, Adam being taught all the names. So do you want to talk about that at all?
I mean, yeah, like conceptually, like I said, if I can believe, for example, God is doing everything, right? Like when combustion is happening, it's, God moving the things around, whether you take the, Ibn Taymiyyah's view or the occasionalist view. But what I do have problem with is like, okay, that can be proven false by, I don't know, I mean, Neanderthals, could they have done that? Do we know? Like, is that even knowable at all? So, I mean, I don't know. Like, my kind of question is, if I can believe human origins are miraculous, like, why couldn't that fit in with sort of your take that it's, we all have monkey ancestors, so to speak?
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe this is worth mentioning too, because we talked about, I think Tom mentioned kind of like the gradual development of humans or whatever, but I think maybe one of the more important lessons of evolutionary developmental biology over the last little while is that, big changes tend to happen relatively quickly, often in lineages, so you can get like total rearrangements of body plans from fairly small mutations. You can get very quick adaptive speciation in fish that doesn't require much mutational changes. A lot of people point to like one generation, like there would be a whole genome duplication and a whole new species will appear as a result of that genome duplication. So I think there's also maybe room for thinking about this and moving beyond this kind of phyletic gradualist view and saying, like what, I mean, when we talk about miracles, right, like the miraculous creation of Adam in an Ash'ari context, what we actually mean is a departure from the habit of God, right? Like habit, or God has a habit that he generates creatures in a particular way, and a miracle is like something that's unusual by the standard of that habit. And unusual things happen in biology, like, on geological time pretty routinely. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like a lot of these things are compatible.
Well, I don't know if you've ever seen, I believe it's Dr. Jalajal. I might be pronouncing his name wrong, but his sort of take was he's a biologist. He believes whatever that means in evolution, but his sort of take is that the ayat that God created Adam has a zahir or apparent meaning. We can't take it to be a metaphor any more than believing that Jesus's birth was a miracle, like a metaphor, or splitting of the Red Sea. It's just the departure from God's natural habit. So, I mean, why do you think that wouldn't fit in your view? Why do you think that the Adamic creation process is better explained by naturalistic means?
I don't know that it is. I mean, I think you're right about a lot of these things where, like, you're talking about, like, how would we know, for instance, in Neanderthals, whether or not they could have, like, this neotenization process, and, like, did they develop language and all these? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think probably, like, the things that Tom was saying about, we're never going to figure this out. Like, yeah, there are probably epistemic constraints on us here that make it impossible to even say really, like, because I mean, for most people, probably just like the simple explanation, the face value of the scripture actually is a better explanation because it's more related to like what they need to get out of that story. And the details of like, well, how was his body generated? I mean, like, what are the implications, right? Like for most people, there aren't any, I would say. So I don't know. I mean, maybe the standard kind of like orthodox explanation is enough, and unless you're like professionally involved in generating evolutionary models, you don't need to deal with it.
I mean, like in the Quranic narrative, the creation of Adam, as you said, he's been taught the names. It's clearly miraculous, sort of like the splitting of the Red Sea, for example, right? I don't
Yeah.
think a Muslim would be like, or I don't know. It just strikes me as weird. Like, you would never be like, oh well, the Red Sea, there was like a gale force wind that came through, and
I
it's
have
actually
seen
total.
that. I've seen those kinds of explanations.
I mean, but like I said, I mean, if your basis is that there's this all powerful, entity that can do anything he wills, is it really necessary to provide 100% naturalistic? Like, I don't know if you get what I'm saying. It
No,
just
I-
it just
yeah,
strikes
yeah.
me as it just strikes me as a little unnecessary.
It is unnecessary, I think, and I mean, people who are worried about evolutionary explanations should understand that the point of evolutionary explanations is to explain the appearance of biological diversity and biological complexity, right? It's not to talk about the origin of life. It's not to talk about the origin of particular species, right? It's an explanation of the fact that there are enormously complex organisms here when, in the past there seem to have been more simple organisms, and also that, those organisms are highly diverse, but just in spite of that diversity, they, through their development reliably converge on particular body plans and so on. Like that's the target of those explanations, right? And if you're not basically, like, if your questions are not about what cells are doing in development or something like that, then yeah, like I don't think there is very much value to evolutionary explanations.
Well, that's
Right.
what both sides are missing, really. Like that, neither side is really getting at that issue at all, and they're kind of like jumping over that to argue about these secondary things.
Right. Like, I think, like a biologist would consider it totally ridiculous if you asked them, like, oh, what was that one saber-toothed tiger doing? Like, what is the details of its life?
Yeah.
100,000 years ago, they'd just be like, that's not really relevant. I can't make any claims about that, right?
Yeah, and typically, I mean, I think the epistemic claims that are made in the literature are like way more modest than what's presented in, kind of the popular scientific, discourse, if you want to call it that. And they're a lot more tenuous and just accepting of the fact that, the era when people considered like, okay, evolution is proved beyond a doubt because Fisher did a whole bunch of statistical analyses, in 1955 or whatever, like that's over. And I think people clearly recognize, particularly since the genetics revolution, we don't know as much as we think we do, and there are orders and orders of complexity above genetics that sometimes the causal arrow runs down, right? Like there are systems organized on top of the genetic infrastructure that impinge like downwards causally onto genes. So it's not the case that we can explain everything in terms of evolution, because really, I mean, there's no formal evolutionary explanation for anything that doesn't refer to genes primarily, right? That's the level at which we're talking when we're talking about evolutionary explanations. So if you're not talking, it's like the evopsych stuff, like those guys are just like they have no idea what they're talking about, right? Like you cannot make evolutionary inferences in one species without any genetic information about like what specific genetic mechanism results in your phenotype of interest. You can't do it. You cannot make those inferences. So like all of that stuff is just total nonsense, right? Like if you're not talking about something specific and genetic, like just don't bother, right? Like just why do you care about this theory, I guess, Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is true that females cannot read, right? Like that's still true, right?
Reportedly.
Okay, all right, just checking because you kind of shattering my worldview there. I wanted to throw some scenarios at you guys and just see what you think. just given that I think we've kind of established that as long as you essentially hold to some very basic guidelines around like this is the narrative that we've been taught, and you can kind of fit evolution into that in whatever way makes sense to you. I want to throw some scenarios at you that I think are sort of like the common ideas, like, okay, so if evolution is true, then how does Adam fit into that? So one idea that I've seen batted around is the idea of Adam either being some sort of like the first Neanderthal or whatever. I might even be using these terms wrong, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But the first Neanderthal that had some sort of like higher cognitive ability that he, either through, I mean, you can use a naturalistic explanation for this, or even it can just be like a miraculous thing, like God just imbued him with this ability that gave him some sort of like higher consciousness that we can kind of recognize as like, like humanity as we understand it today. What are your takes on that? Does that seem to, I don't know, does anyone here believe that, or does that kind of go against anyone's beliefs pretty hard, or what?
I mean, like if you just go back and look at the Quran, human beings are constantly referred to as Bani Adam, the children of Adam. That's who this is for. Biologically, and Mike, you can explain it like what exactly a species is. It's different than the religious explanation for it. I think biology is just based off, like, the biological species is totally different than like a specific, as Muslim believes, like one like family of humanity. Mike, you can explain the species thing, but it's totally different. So
that's super important.
So you see that as like a conflict?
Yeah, I mean, like when a Muslim is talking, he's talking about X amount of people, all descendant from this pair of people, which it's totally different than a biologist talking about breeding populations and things like that.
Okay, so maybe that's not a conflict though. So maybe you could say that the Muslim terminology for Bani Adam doesn't refer at all to any kind of predecessors to Adam in any way.
Right. I mean, it refers to all the people descended from Adam, whether he was super different than what we would consider human today or things like that. I mean, it just doesn't make claims about that.
Right. Okay.
So.
Yeah, I think that's right on, and it's really important to distinguish between biological species concepts, which are very vague and often difficult to parse, and sometimes not much better than just your kind of like average like Linnaean phylogeny. But I think it might be worth mentioning that we have like also the terms in the Quran like bashar and insan, which are used not quite interchangeably, and those things are different as well from Bani Adam, right? Like we're concerned about lineage when we're talking about Bani Adam. And then there are these kinds of other categories of just sort of like general appellations for, I don't know. I mean, like I'm loath even to just say like hominids, although I guess that's kind of what they are. But, it doesn't make sense to try to map species onto any of those concepts for sure.
Okay. The other idea, I guess, is the sort of classic like primordial ooze. Where would Adam fit into that narrative? Where can we put Adam if there's a primordial ooze where all life comes from and it evolves into some kind of definitely not human life form, and eventually we get to some kind of something more closely resembling that? Like where do we get to the point where we can say like, okay, well that's probably where Adam comes from?
I think you need all of the biological infrastructure that's required for a human, right? Like you need neurons to be, you need to be in a lineage that has neurons, that has, all of those kinds of things. So I think that they're probably like the primordial ooze kind of story is around in various forms, but probably like some variant of that is the explanation for why the genetic code is fixed like throughout all species, that it only happened once, and that the first kind of cells that successfully got set up we're all descended from those. So I mean, I would think that that's not incompatible with the idea that, okay, Adam's biological material is like literally raised from the stinking muck. But his
mixing clay and water, right? That's like literally,
yeah, and
yeah.
I mean, that seems to me to be like not that far away from the plain sense of the scripture. And then Adam is breathed into, right? The roh is something separate from the muck, right? He's not just clay. He's got this breath of God in him, and that's to me. I mean, that seems like the miraculous part, or the part that cannot ever receive a naturalistic explanation, right? Like in the Quran, it says, like of the soul, but a little, right? Like there are hard kind of epistemic limits on what we can say about like, how does ensoulment work? What is a soul? Where is it? Etc. We're not going to answer those questions. So.
Right. And it's the same thing is said about Jesus, that like that's his conception is through the ruh, the soul being like blown into Mary.
Yeah.
Right, and then there's a narrative in the Quran where, God I believe he tells Jesus to, take some clay and put it in the bird narrative. I don't know the details, but essentially Jesus breathes into a bird, and through God's power, it comes to life. Right? I mean, like we don't go around saying, well, okay, what about the birds that are descended from that magic bird that Jesus came up and had that miracle, like. Is that not a bird? Like, is that not it just kind of seems very, I don't know. It's just, I think by focusing too much about scientific definitions of species, you lose a little bit in the process, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree. This is just for fun. Let me just kind of clarify. Like, these are not like serious attempts at explaining things. I just thought, kind of toss these out there and see what happens. Yeah, I don't know. I guess those were the two that really came to mind. Does anyone have any like particular personal ideas that they want to share about like what they tend to believe about these things? Like with the again the caveat that like we're not saying that this is definitively true or anything like that, but just like what is your understanding? If you have anything.
I just take the maximally skeptical thing, and I think it'd be better if we refrained from making sort of narratives. Like one useful thing is I don't know. I think there's a lot of like narrativizing that goes around. You're told like a monkey's your grandfather, I guess, and I don't know. Like I don't think making claims about that sort of thing is beneficial.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah.
Like I'm a little bit literalist about the Adam part. Like I just kind of take that like as is, but I don't know. I think that's a good answer in and of itself.
Sure. So you would kind of tend towards the more like traditional understanding of just like says God made Adam, so sounds like God made Adam.
Right.
It seems kind of clear to me that like at least some people are disturbed by inquiring into this, right? And I mean, I think it's worth remembering that the claims that are often made for evolutionary theory are part of a social process of the establishment of a scientific orthodoxy, and that's constantly contested, right? Like things are a lot more uncertain than a lot of people would have you believe, and explanations for the appearance of biological diversity are getting really weird. Like in the literature, things are pretty strange, right? There was a paper published 2 years ago about African lake cichlids, which are some of the most diverse species on the planet. Like there's one lake, the Lake Malawi, that has something like it's like 1,000 different species of cichlids, and it's a
sorry, what is that? Is that like a bug?
Oh, sorry, it's a fish. It's a fish. So
okay.
These are very closely related genetically fish, but there's like literally 1,000 different reproductively isolated populations of them in one lake in Africa. So it's it's a big lake, but there's a lot of species. The mutational rate in those species is lower than in humans. So if the conventional story about, like, okay, the mutational clock is what's kind of driving evolutionary innovation is true, then that's not possible, right? So we have a growing body of evidence that things are just way more complicated than, sort of population genetics of the 20th century ever could even conceive, and I think it's way more interesting and inspires, I think, way more awe of the divine to look at the evidence, right, and say, like, what are people actually talking about? Because it's pretty weird, it's pretty crazy, it's worth looking at.
Well, that definitely bolsters my idea that Africans do tend to self-segregate, something.
And I apologize if I didn't make it clear earlier, but I think sort of taking a maximally skeptical kind of approach to this kind of thing is very beneficial, I'd say. Like, for example, something much closer to our time, for example, like if you take at face example, like Roman accounts of history, right? Like Caesar crossed the Tiber, he went into Gaul, he had these battles at these times, that's kind of taken at face value, I guess, at least by the general population, right? But what can we actually say based on the evidence that we have in terms of materials and cultural artifacts? You can only really say that, well, after X date in France, there's a lot more Roman materials, and you can't really make claims about the life of Caesar. Did he really meet, did he really have that civil war with who and who? Did he really meet Cleopatra? You can't really make scientific claims about those sort of things. So, I mean, we do have evidence, okay, there's weird monkeys in the ground, everywhere in Ethiopia. You can't really deny those.
Whoa.
Yeah, I had to throw that in. Yeah, I had to throw that in. But there's Lucy, there's the big jawed bastards that are just coming out of the ground in Africa. And you can say okay, yeah, that existed, that's an animal, but in terms of what exactly happened X amount of years ago about Adam, I'm just taking the most skeptically, I really don't know, but I can have faith in scripture that X happened, and the rest is just, I don't know.
I guess that's kind of how I take it too. This stuff doesn't really pertain to a lot, it doesn't matter to me what actually happened, so I'm just willing to take, I think Imam Malik says, I don't know what the Arabic is, but he said something along the lines of we believe what it says, but we don't necessarily know what it means, kind of a thing.
Exactly.
So if it says God made Adam, fine, what that actually means, sure, I'd be interested in finding out what that means, but we just don't know exactly. We just don't have the actual, evidence to say. So I'm open to whatever. I think that there, just in thinking about it, I think it's easier for me to kind of just have that openness because I don't, I wasn't brought up Muslim. I don't come from a cultural background where we had specific ideas about this. My parents are very non-religious, and there was never any talk about this sort of thing. So for me, it's just sort of oh, that's an interesting question, and I have no investment in it, but I can see where people have a different sort of background with this stuff, where it feels more like an attack on things, and so I'm a little bit more sympathetic, I think, than people maybe tend to be when they kind of have this what they believe to be this scientific knowledge about stuff,
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, most of my life, I was a diehard Richard Dawkins atheist kind of person. So it was very much it was one of those candidate theories for why you would be stupid is if you believed that evolution was fake or something like that, all the Daily Show stuff about it and all that kind of thing, like Simpsons or whatever, and now it's kind of almost it's like the fact of God being real is like so overwhelming over everything else that it's like this stuff doesn't really. It's not it's not like it doesn't end up being the central focal point of, like, I feel like more confused about some of this stuff just because as you know, as you guys were saying, like, you don't know the actual descent of Adam and all that kind of stuff, like how it might have happened or whatever, but you kind of just go, okay, well, you know, because you kind of have that anchor point in that, you know, God is being real and like maybe scripture or something. The other stuff is almost like, well, I'm sure there's some reason, you know, it's like, I'm sure I'm sure like somehow it must work out or something. So, and I think that's strange because, it goes really against your experience. If, you know, from me as being a non-believer for so long, that it goes against your experience of being like, well, if it doesn't make sense, it's like you should spend all of your time making it make sense until you figure it out. And then, you know, and instead you're like, no, it just doesn't, it's not the pivot point of it, whatever. So yeah.
Like that's true. I think that's how a lot of people like that think, but I think they also apply this sort of thinking of like, well, it's got to work out somewhere down the line when it comes to like the origin of just like existence and that kind of thing. They're just like, well, like, you know, it's just random chance at some point. I guess it just worked out that way and it doesn't matter exactly how, but you know, like we're here, so I guess that's it.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know, that has always just, like I was saying earlier, that just has always struck me as really remarkably faithful in a sense, you know?
I guess I should say I sympathize with the impulse to, like, you want to make all the lore consistent, right? You want to have like no conflicts with like your whole conception of the way that everything works. But you know, at some point, like you do have to deal with the fact that like you're never going to complete the system, right? Like you're never going to have the whole picture.
Humble yourself before God. He's created this crazy world. Like,
and it is crazy, right? Like wild stuff happens all the time, you know. And I think, like, kind of the thing that I would say about it as someone who's like professionally exposed to it is that if you are having like real problems with this, you know, where it's like you cannot think of an alternative explanation for the data that's like somewhat, you know, explanatory and fits with your theology, there's probably a defect in your theology or your understanding of biology, right? Like there should be, most good biologists can think of many explanations that are consistent with particular sets of data under particular, you know, fact generating paradigms. And if you can't do that, and what you end up doing is like, you know, getting really anxious or like being really argumentative online or something like this, like it's not going well for you. You know, you need to go back to the basics and have a perspective that, you know, all of this stuff kind of has a social context, and it's not really about the truth a lot of the time, you know, and you don't have to get upset about it because you're not going to resolve it finally.
Right. And the culture warriors just figure out what you actually care about and argue about that thing, and stop bringing in all this like silly kind of like facade to cover it. Like if you're concerned about some like the political dynamics, just argue about that. Like, you know, they tend to do that anyway. So just, you know, stay in your lane, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like that stuff is just getting crazy where you can't talk about anything because it somehow overlaps with culture war, and then you end up like whatever you say, you're somehow on one camp or the other. And that's really poisonous.
Right, and it seems especially dangerous for you get really mad about, you know, cuties on Netflix or something like that, to the point where you're claiming like, well, God can't do evolution because this and that. It's like you're kind of like just really like you're like falling into like a bigger trap of like, okay, well now you're doing like sort of doing shirk just because you want to win an argument, you know?
Yeah. Just as like a random thing that I just remembered was that they did make a movie about like the Red Sea being parted recently, I guess, like called Exodus, Gods and Kings, which it had Christian Bale in it and stuff, and it was directed by Ridley Scott. So it's like, you know, like a big kind of epic movie and stuff. I don't think it did well. And in it, they have like the scene where I remember where they like part the Red Sea and stuff. I'm pretty sure that in the movie there's no supernatural element to that. Like, it happens, but it's not clear whether or not, it just looks like a big storm. Now, it's an enormous storm, so you could say maybe it's supernatural because it's big. But, the storm sweeps out all the water, and then they can walk across and whatever. So I thought that was funny because, it's just like Ridley Scott had to kind of put in the movie kind of thing. Like, everything had to be, like, these stories might be true, but they might not be supernatural. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, they try to do that now. So it's like, God is nature, or nature is God, sort of a thing.
Yeah.
It sort of highlights like the anxiety that people have around this like science versus religion sort of debate, where they are trying to like elegantly like reconcile the two by having it be something that is awe-inspiring in a way where it's like if you were to see that, you could see how someone would think it was God even if it wasn't, sort of a thing. And I don't know, I think it ends up just doing a disservice to both sides, because it's like that it's not going to happen like in a normal circumstance. Like that's just not, it has to either be a miracle or it didn't happen, sort of a thing. Like that's almost the point of it being in the religion.
Yeah.
Like that's a miracle, is exactly that. Like it's something that can't normally happen, but it did anyways. So it really misses the point of miracles entirely when you kind of like do this like, well, maybe both can be true thing.
Yeah.
I think there is something to be said for, if what you want to do is argue online, there is something to be said for attacking some of the metaphysical components that people rely on in evolutionary explanations, because I think a lot of them are unjustified, and particularly randomness is one to go after. I mean, like if you want to strike a blow for traditional Islam or something, then probably what you should be going after is like frequentist statistics and the Copenhagen interpretation, because those are the kinds of things that people rely on to kind of present this naturalistic view of causality, where things just kind of happen spontaneously and there's no need for God, right? Like there are good scientific alternatives to those kinds of interpretations, specifically like Bayesian statistics, as well as Bohmian mechanics in the quantum realm. And there's really no reason to accept the idea that, like random variables are actually instantiated in the world or anything like that. And I think those are like way more productive kinds of lines of debate than to attack some like vague conception of evolution or evolutionary theory because we're worried about the parentage of Adam. Like I think that probably won't go anywhere.
So, what would you say? I mean, it's obviously an issue that's affected like a lot of people's faith. What would you say to a parent that's saying, my kid is being taught this, and it's really affecting him, and I really don't know anything about it. They might not know statistics or quantum physics or anything like that. What would you suggest to somebody like that?
Yeah, I like send your kid to me. I don't know. Honestly, like for me, I think that this is one of the realms where biologists have really fallen down. Like the biologists in the Muslim community is sort of like aggressively exposing what's going on in biological discourse, because a lot of it is not what people are arguing about and people are anxious about, and it's definitely not what's being taught to kids in high school and stuff like this, right? Because the people who are teaching evolutionary theory, quote unquote, to students in high school or whatever, normally have not conducted any research themselves in evolutionary theory, right? They're people with a bachelor's degree who went and got a BEd, and now they're saying like whatever the liberal orthodoxy is. And I think really the only solution to this problem, like within the community, is to actually gird people with the intellectual resources they need. And I think that means like Muslim biologists need to step up and need to get involved in the theoretical discourse way more than they are right now.
Would you say adopting I know a lot of early Christian and biblical studies and early Quranic studies, secular studies, have been, applying a really super skeptical approach to everything. Do you think that sort of thing would be very beneficial to questioning sort of the narratives that people just get fed?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should teach the history of these theories and kind of the social context, and like the stuff that we were mentioning, for instance, about the eugenicists and those kinds of things. Like, people need to know about that, and they also need to know that like the scientific discourse is way more diverse than is normally presented, and that the actual kind of formal contents of the theories are much more limited than anyone normally represents them. So I think being skeptical and teaching the material as it is, in all its kind of like dirty historical context, can help a lot, for sure.
Yeah, sounds good. Send them to Mike, people.
Yes, send them to Mike and sign up for the You Can't Win Patreon. So we'll do some special education episodes for the kids. All right, guys, I think this is a good place to wrap up here. We will skip questions for this week, since I think we did a lot this episode. So we'll leave it here for now. Thanks for coming on. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for finally coming on, Akh, and it was nice to talk to you again, Mike.
Nice talking to you as well.
Pleasure.
Okay, guys. So if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like a second episode of You Can't Win every week, you can sign up for the Patreon and you'll get that. In addition to access to our Discord, where you can chat with us in our community. If you want to send us anonymous questions that we normally answer on our public episodes, you can do that by sending them to the Curious Cat anonymously. The link for that is attached to the Twitter account of the podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next week.